Hi, everybody.
Hi, Professor.
Hi, Professor.
Hi, Professor.
Okay, so let's start this meeting. Last time, as you still remember, we talked about correlational research. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to cover all of the slides, all of the points that the chapter we read before covered. And again, unfortunately, because today we're going to have a busy schedule, we're going to talk about descriptive research. And as you may have noticed from the chapter again that you were assigned to read for this week, it is full of details, and I don't think that we're going to be able to cover that in 1 hour and a half. Meaning we're not going to spend too much time on the remainder of last time's main topic, which was correlational research. And when I just ran my eyes over the points that we didn't have the chance to talk about, I noticed that they are not of great difficulty, meaning you can understand them without my assistance. And for this reason, I'm going to leave them just like home reading. That's number one. Number two, today we're going to talk, as I said, about descriptive research. And among the points we're going to raise are behavioral observation, survey research, and also case study design. As far as case study design is concerned, well, I don't know whether we're going to be able to talk about that in 1 hour and a half or not, but we're going to see. If we have the chance, if we still have some remaining time, we can talk about that. If not, we can leave it until next time. One more thing I would like to raise before we kickstart today's meeting is the question of participation. I noticed over the couple of meetings that we've had so far online, some of your friends, they are logged in. I can see them, I can see their logos, I can see their pictures, but they do not participate as much as I would like them to do, which is not a good thing. That is, I need to hear your voices. What we are doing in this course cannot boil down only to the paper you are required to turn in by the end of the semester and also the final examination, but an important degree of weighting would go to participation in these online meetings. That is, give me an idea of the extent to which you've been able to understand the material you've been assigned to read. And therefore, please make sure that you participate, make your voice heard, interact with us, ask questions, so I can help you out whenever there is some ambiguity, something that you don't understand in clear terms. So please, this is an invitation for those of you who do not participate in these online meetings. That's number two, I guess. Before I continue, is the line fine, clear? Everything is loud and clear for everyone?
Yes.
Professor.
Yes, there is.
Okay, great. One more thing I would like to talk about before we start talking about descriptive research is curvilinearity. I noticed, I don't know how I missed that. That is, I even did not include it in one of the slides that we dealt with. But we're going to open a small niche where we can try to understand what is this idea of curvilinearity. And in connection to curvilinearity, I would like to refer to a point in time as we were in the course of having that discussion of correlational research. We talked about the difference between a linear relationship and a non-linear relationship. And I must tell you guys that what I can see before me is, just wait a second until I turn off my mobile phone. Here we go. What I see before me on the screen is the PowerPoint slides that are the basis, that are the object of the discussions that we have. And I don't see those messages that you send me from time to time. I see them only when I log off. That is when I terminate the meeting. When I did last time terminate the meeting, I noticed that at a certain point in time, especially when we were talking about the difference between a linear and a non-linear relationship, Hamza, your friend Hamza, uploaded a diagram that compares two graphs, one visually representing a linear relationship and the other a non-linear relationship. And the non-linear relationship was in fact a curvilinear relationship between two variables. So here we have to understand something here. Concerning linear relationship, I think that's quite clear, basic idea to understand it. Just you need to draw, you use a scatter plot and you draw a line that would run across all of the points, or more or less across, because we wouldn't have 100% connection across all of the points we have in the scatter plot, but it's a more or less relationship between all of those points that are included in that scatter plot. The problem is with non-linear relationship. When we have a curvilinear relationship, that's basically non-linear. That's why in that graph you uploaded, Hamza. I don't know whether Hamza is on with us or not. Hamza, are you in?
Yes, I am in, Professor.
Okay, do you still remember the graph I'm talking about?
Yes, I do. I do remember.
Okay, so focusing on this idea of a non-linear relationship, a curvilinear and a non-linear, it's one thing, but there is a basic difference between the two, because a curvilinear refers to a particular phenomenon. And that is something I would like to ask you a question about in a few seconds to come. A non-linear relationship, that is basically, we don't have this idea of a curve. That's why it's not called curvilinear. But a non-linear, that's something that is a relationship that is purely non-linear. It's not like, it doesn't have a certain systematic pattern that we can see. And remember the graph I uploaded when I wanted to explain to you a non-linear relationship. It was like a circle filled with different points scattered over the graph, which doesn't help us really see that there is a clear pattern in the relationship that we have in hand. Okay, so this is just a little bit of clarification as far as that graph that Hamza uploaded. Now my question to you, so as not to forget the point I have in mind, my question to you, this idea of curvilinearity that we glossed over last time, what does it mean to you guys?
Professor?
Yes, please, go ahead.
A curve linear correlation indicates both a positive and negative correlation in the course of one correlational test.
Great. Yes, great. Can you please, this is good, this is good. If you have more to say on this, it's good. If not, one of your friends can jump in and add more details so we can understand what this idea of at the same time positive and negative, what does it mean?
Professor? Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. A curvilinear relationship is that type of relationship between the two variables where when one variable increases, the other variable increases as well, but only up to a certain point. After this point, as one variable continues to increase, the other variable sort of decreases.
Good, great. Just to give a concrete example. Remember, again, by exemplification, we understand things better. Can you give me an example where we have this idea of in its initial phase, it could be positive, but at a certain level, it becomes negative. Give me an example so you can make me understand what is going on here, please. Yes.
Professor?
Yes, please, go ahead, go ahead.
An example can be the correlation between the pressure from the teacher and the student's performance. For example, a certain degree from teachers, a certain degree of pressure from teachers can push students to work harder and improve their performances in the exams and assignments in general. But if it increases to a very high degree of pressure, then students may feel frustrated and may not follow up with the teacher. So here we have two types of correlation. At first, it was positive. As the pressure increases, the student's performance increases as well. But then at a certain point, the correlation becomes negative.
Okay, that's great. That's great. The others, if you have some other example, just the floor is yours. If not, we can move on.
Professor, another example would be stress and academic success. For example, if there's a little bit of stress, then it will motivate students to do better in their studies. But if there's too much stress, then it will lead to anxiety and then lack of motivation. To some extent, it will turn to a disease rather than motivation.
Okay, great. That's fine, great. So that's it. Now, before, as we usually do, before we start talking about descriptive research, I don't know whether the time is was good, because normally we should have talked about descriptive research the moment we talked about descriptive statistics, because when we bring those two words together, the picture becomes crystal clear. We understand things in ways that are more effective than it would if there is an interval of I don't know, 1 or 2 topics that we covered between talking about descriptive statistics and talking about descriptive research. But we can bring them together in this discussion so we can understand things much better. So last time we talked about a whole bunch of different topics related to correlational research, and we saw that correlational research is not, that is something that is simple. Just you take 2 variables and you try to bring them together to say whether there is or there isn't a relationship between them. But it's more than that. Okay. Again, I'm not going to go point by point. Just let me know anything that you still remember, anything that you still retain of the session that went by. Just jump in and let us know about that. That is everything that we talked about, scales of measurement, correlational, that is the 3 main points related to correlation, significance, and all of the other stuff that we covered last time. And it would be really nice if I hear the voices of other participants, not those usual voices I interact with during all of the meetings that we've had so far. The floor is yours, guys.
Sir, one thing that I found quite interesting in correlational research is when you have continuous variables, but also discrete or categorical variables that you need to measure, and the measurements that researchers use in from the to from the correlation and the correlation coefficient to the what is called the phi coefficient, or the if I'm pronouncing it right.
You're talking about the different statistics that
exactly.
Okay, good.
Yes.
All right, so that's one thing we talked about. So that is, when we talk about scales of measurement, that is, we don't only talk about them in and of themselves, but we talk about them because they are basic, because there are certain assumptions we need to observe when we want to use certain statistical procedures. If you are not careful about this, if you do not know the nature of the variables that you are dealing with, you're going to be using certain statistics that are not appropriate for the kind of research that you are doing, and therefore we need to be careful as far as that is concerned. Okay, something else, guys, that we talked about.
Sir,
Hamza.
I have a question. If you could please give us a hint on what the nature of the size effect might be, because we talked about the fact that correlation coefficients alone are not representative of strong correlations, and that they are very sensitive to sample size, and that we should include the size effect with them. Could you please, yes, the effect size. Could you please tell us a little bit on what the effect size is?
Okay, good, Hamza. Good question, Hamza. We talked about this in this context where we were trying to see the importance of the p-value, the confidence level. One important observation that we made is that the sensitiveness of the we observed that the p-value is sensitive to the size of the sample that you are dealing with. That is, if you have a small sample, the chances are that you are not going to find that there is a statistically significant relationship between the variables that you are dealing with. This doesn't mean in the real world. What is the real world? When I say the real world, I'm referring to the population, because remember, you are taking a sample from that is from a larger population. It's as if you are saying that within the population, there is no statistically significant relationship. But there might be a statistically significant relationship, and you did not manage to get it. It's only because the sample was too small. That's why I remember, again, I talked about 2 different types of errors concerned with statistics, type 1 error and type 2 error. And therefore, when you have a larger sample, you might find that there is a correlation, statistically significant correlation between the variables that you are studying, But in fact, there is no correlation between the two. It's only the size of your sample that has driven you to find that there is a statistically significant correlation. But in fact, there might not be such a correlation. What is the take-home lesson here? The take-home lesson is that the p-value is too sensitive to the size of the sample, and therefore, when you write your research report, you should not content yourself with the reporting of the p-value only, because when you do that, you are not helping your readers, you are not helping the research community to which you are affiliated, that is those researchers doing the same kind of research that you are doing. And therefore, to give them a clearer picture about what you arrived at, the conclusions that you arrived at, you need to refer to something that is called effect size. And what is effect size? What is good about effect size that we do not have in the p-value? Effect size, of course, I'm not going to talk about, because I'm not in a good position to talk about that. I'm not an expert in mathematics to give you the formula of what the effect size is. But according to experts, according to statisticians, effect size is not sensitive to the size of the sample. Meaning, when you use the p-value, it's always good to use the p-value. I'm not saying that when you include the effect size, you're not going to talk about the p-value. The p-value is always important. You need to include it. But alongside with it, you need to refer to the effect size, because the effect size measure gives us an estimate of how powerful the relationship that you are talking about is. And the power of the relationship is regardless of the sample size. This is why it is recommended, strongly recommended in research reports to refer not only to the p-value, to refer not only to the confidence level, but to accompany it with an effect size. Again, talking about effect size, we have a variety of different measures that you may want to talk about. Last time I talked to you about the Cohen's d, and I said that SPSS cannot calculate Cohen's d. That is, you need to go to certain online facilities, certain online platform that offers services with regard to how to calculate effect size, that is Cohen's d. Usually you use the mean and the standard deviation of the variable or the variables that you are concerned with. You input them into certain boxes, and then it automatically gives you the value of Cohen's d. We have other measures. As I said, we have Cohen's f. Cohen's d, we use it in certain contexts. Cohen's f can be used in a different context. There is what is called also the eta value. Eta value is something that comes along with MANOVA and Mankova. That is, when you calculate this in SPSS, along with estimates related to covariance, it gives you another important estimate related to the power of the relationship that you found between one and another variable, or a group, or two different groups of variables, independent and dependent. So this is it. To recap, it is highly recommended, it is strongly recommended that when you report that there is a statistically significant relationship between two variables, and you report the p-value, alongside with it, you need to mention the effect size, because the effect size compensates for the weakness of Cohen's d, and therefore it is very useful to mention the effect size so as to have a good position. You are standing on a good ground when you report your research statistics, your research conclusions. Does that answer your question, Hamza?
Yes, sir. Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So I think that's it. If you have anything to add with regard to what we did last time, so we talked about significance here. Let me see here. Are we clear about the difference between a continuous variable and discrete variable? That is, in briefly, someone to just remind us of what we talked about in relation to this difference between these two.
A discrete variable cannot take all the possible values between one value and another.
Example, if you can. Example.
The number of players in a team. It cannot be 10.5.
Good. And again, when we talk about correlation, remember there are three important estimates we need to be aware of. the existence of a relationship, the direction of a relationship, and the magnitude. Again, briefly, someone to remind us of what we said about this.
Sir?
Yes, yes.
Mohammed, when we talk about directionality, we have two possible relationships. We can have either a positive one, these two variables changing, that is, both of them increase or decrease. We usually indicate by a plus sign. As for the negative one, on the other hand, one variable increases, the other decreases, and we indicate them by minus sign.
Good. So the first thing we talked about is the existence of a relationship, because that's what we are interested in. That's why you are doing your research, because you want to test a hypothesis, and that hypothesis, depending on what kind of hypothesis you are using. If you are using a null hypothesis, you are trying to refute the null hypothesis, because the null hypothesis says that there is no statistically significant relationship between two variables. Okay, and your aim, your objective, eventually, when you do your research, is to say that this idea of the non-existence of a relationship is wrong. And when I collected data and analyzed it, I found that indeed it is wrong. So you reject the null hypothesis. And of course, we have again to be careful. When you do research and you find that there is no statistically significant relationship between the variables you are examining, that doesn't mean that you failed in one way or another. That doesn't reflect failure. That is, a non-result is not synonymous with failure. That's a result. That is important in its own right. And therefore, you shouldn't be afraid of that is after collecting data and analyzing it and finding that there is no correlation between the variables. It doesn't mean that your research has bumped into the wall. That's still something important, and you need to report it in a paper. You need to report that in a paper. So this is again something that we need to be clear about. So that's as far as the existence of a relationship. Now the direction, again, we saw we have different directions. If one goes up, the other goes up, and that's positive. And if one goes up and the other goes down, that's negative. Magnitude is the strength of the relationship. Okay, and we saw if you use Pearson product moment coefficient, we saw the closer it is to +1 and the closer it is to -1, the stronger the relationship between the variables that we are talking about. And again, we have different levels. We have strong relationship, we have moderate relationship, and we have weak relationship. So all of that are points, are ideas that we covered the session that went by. We're not going to continue with that. This is a summary, useful summary for those of you who maybe forgot some of the things we covered last time. Now we move on to talk about descriptive research. As I pointed out, talking about descriptive research, there are so many ideas that we're gonna have to cover. But in the meanwhile, just let me upload the PowerPoint presentation I prepared for this occasion. Just give me a few seconds. Okay. Okay, before the file uploads, take this question, please. Reading the chapter on descriptive research, what is the impression that you got about descriptive research? What is your reaction to it? How do you rate it? Is it important kind of research? Is it not really important? That is, what is this takeaway idea or takeaway ideas that you got having finished reading the chapter?
Sir, I think descriptive research has focuses more, has external validity on the expense of internal validity, since it's described phenomena as they are in their natural, and do not interfere, do not use manipulation or control or any tools to control the extraneous variables. So like we tend to focus to rely more on what we see. So somehow our senses could fool us in a way.
Okay, good, Mohammed. Another related question, because this is a good question to start with.
Professor?
Who?
Mariam.
Okay, please, Mariam, go ahead.
While in the descriptive research, I can say that it is a basic step in doing research, because before doing any other type of or any other kind of research, the researcher needs to know what are his variables or the variables, what is the nature of the variables that he is going to work on in his research. So it is a preliminary research.
Good. Good, Mariam, thank you. Another question, another related question is this. Having read the chapter, was there anything that struck you as unusual, something that was really intriguing after you have read the chapter, something maybe we talked about in one way, but when you read the chapter, you found that it deals with the issue or with the issues we talked about in a different way, something similar, something that struck you as odd, as idiosyncratic, and so on. So please just let me know if that's the case.
Yes, sir, definitely. There were many intriguing and striking things about the chapter. But there was one concept which I found to be very flawed in a sense. And I don't know, I have some arguments. I don't know if I should talk about them now, but I would say
that's the place. That's the right place to talk about that, Yunus.
But I'd like that we proceed and reach that point, and then I can raise the problem.
Great.
What's important is that the observer paradox. I have many questions concerning that, concerning the observer paradox and how it is suggested to eliminate this paradox. I don't agree with many of the solutions provided, because I see that these solutions are flawed, especially having this new experimental set of mind, and right after it, reading descriptive research, you should, I mean, find it very find that it has many limitations or challenges.
Great, Yunus. It's good to have to have critical thinking, to employ your critical mindset when you approach the material I assign you to read. It's always good. And when we get to that, when we start talking about this, then we can elaborate on it. Your friends can comment on that, and I'm, of course, as I usually do, try to provide you with more details that can help to make things a little bit clearer. Okay? Maybe this. Okay, Yunus. The thing that I'm driving at is case study research, case study design. Was there anything intriguing when you read case study design? Something maybe I said and appears to you to be contradictory? Because I said a few things, and they might apparently, on the surface of it, they might appear to be contradictory. But of course, there is nothing contradictory about that, as I'm gonna explain to you when the time comes for that. But I would like you to tell me, because you need to be a shrewd observer. You should have a keen eye on those small details which can lead you to a better understanding of what we're going to talk about in this meeting. Yes, please. Maybe the first observation, just to help you. Maybe you are not overwhelmed with my question. The first thing that needs to come to your minds is this. In what context did we talk about case study research? This is the first thing you need to ask questions about, guys.
Professor?
Who? Hamza?
No, it's
Nasruddin.
There is a line in page 387. Case studies can lead directly to general laws or theories.
Great. That's one of the intriguing things about this. Great remark. And what do you think about that, guys?
I think it might be the case.
Can you say more on that? Can you say more on that?
Yes. If we look at the codes to theory model in qualitative research, we start with codes, then categories, then themes, concepts, then we transcend the concrete nature of our data to what is abstract and what is theoretical. And I think this is the process that case study follows. It starts with concrete data, and it ascends to a more general and more abstract level of analysis. And I think, yes, using case studies, we can generate theories.
Yeah, sir, and there was an example in the chapter, the development theories of Jean Piaget on his children. Like he has started from his own children, and he has generalized this on other children.
Okay, good. So now we're talking about, this is exactly what I would like you to pay attention to, this idea of the generalizability of the results when we use case study research. Miriam, yes, please.
This idea of generalization, in the chapter, it was said that the detailed description that we can get from a case study leads to poor generalization. But as Mohammed mentioned, Piaget in his in the theory of cognitive development, the theory of cognitive development that he proposed, he based his work on case study. That is, he observed his own children, and he was able to generalize that what he found on all the children.
Miriam, can you just allow me to jump in and say something important here? Why was it possible? That's why I'm asking you to use your critical mind to understand what is going on here. Why do you think Piaget used observations on his own children, and based on those observations, he came up with his developmental stage cognitive theory? Why was he successful? Of course, successful. Yes?
There was no counter-example from case studies. Sometimes there were no counter-example for his case study. We can say that a case study it cannot be generalized if there is a counter-example. Like we
okay, just Mohammed, there is again something here I would like to clarify. Remember, one of the golden rules we need to understand about research, one of the golden rules we need to understand about science is that there is nothing absolute. Nothing absolute. Okay? Even Piaget, we're talking about Piaget's theory of cognitive development. And that's something that is significant in the history of science, that is in the how humans develop. But we need to be careful here. There are critics of Piaget. Okay, it doesn't mean that nobody leveled criticism at the ideas, the propositions, and the theoretical foundations of Piaget's cognitive developmental cognitive theory. There are pitfalls in what he was talking about there. So we shouldn't take whatever theory, whatever researcher, whatever scholar, whatever they say, we should not take it as the Quran. There is always something there. If you don't find something to criticize, it's simply you are not looking closer enough. When you closely examine, when you closely inspect it, you're going to find that there are a few things that you might, for example, just to give you an idea about some of the one of the criticisms that was leveled at Piaget's developmental cognitive theory. That is, remember, he's talking about a set of theories, one following the other. That is, more than that, he's even specifying the age at which one stage is over and the other kicks in. But does that apply to children all over the world? That sequencing of that chronological sequencing of events. That is, if you apply it to the whole world, you're going to find that some children in certain contexts, they spend more time in one stage than children in another context. And therefore, this idea of generalizing whatever Piaget was talking about is not tenable in all contexts. It doesn't apply to all contexts. So we need to be careful. Whatever scholar we're dealing with, There is only one person whom we cannot criticize, and that's the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. Except for that, anybody, any theorist, any researcher, any scholar is amenable to criticism, and we need to criticize them because this is the academia. This is what is good about the academia. All right, is that clear for everyone?
Yes.
Yes.
Professor, what I personally found intriguing about case studies, and this is mentioned in page 388, is that case studies can act as counter examples to general rules or general laws. That a detailed description of a single individual can demonstrate an exception to a rule that was probably generated or found in an experimental study.
So we do this. Yunus, just a follow-up question to what you're talking about. We do case study in this with this goal in mind, with the goal to find some counter example. We do it in reaction to what kind of research?
Experimental research.
Correlational and experimental, especially when you have a large sample size. Okay, because when you use a large sample size, you tell us that there is a general law, but as a researcher, someone who is curious, you're going to take one individual and apply whatever was applied in the other research, and then tell the research community that I studied this particular individual, but I didn't find those conclusions that, do you understand the idea?
Yes, yeah.
So that's why we use
that doesn't always work.
Okay, now my question to you
also, sir.
Yes, go ahead, Mariam, go ahead.
Not Mariam, Hamza. Sir, also regarding a case study, yes, a case study may not indeed reflect the universal, the concept of universal being universal when it comes to treatment, but it showed that there is a treatment which could not function. And in the chapter we have the example of phobia. When it comes to phobia, most of the time, that they use a technique called the cognitive desensitization, and it shows that when this notion has disputed this technique when the patient was given a false feedback. So here we can see that the notion which we most of the time rely on the generalizability, a case study could go against this notion to bring about the exception. So a case study most of the time deals also with certain exceptions when it comes to any phenomenon.
Good, great. Now, just briefly, because we don't want to spend the whole meeting talking about case study. In fact, at the beginning, I said that we're not going to talk even about case study research, and now we're spending, I guess, more than 20 minutes doing that. So the idea is this: why Piaget was in a position to generalize from those specific instances displayed, those behaviors, those characteristics displayed by his children into the whole population of children the world over. Why was he able to do that? For example, compare this to someone who is studying an adult, or someone who is studying a teenager, or someone who is an elderly, studying an elderly. Does it look the same to you? Is this the same situation?
Professor?
Yes, please.
Maybe because it was a longitudinal study, and he followed his children through the steps or the stages that they went through.
Good. And another question in the same context: what is unique about children? What is unique about children which put Piaget in a good position to generalize?
Professor?
Maybe the universality of the stages that they go through.
That's good. And again, remember, Piaget was doing that in the context of behavioral and social science. And the first understanding we departed from is that behavioral and social science, or the behavioral and social work, is so complex, so fluid. You cannot say, yes, please.
I think, sir, answering your question, I think because of the naturalistic environment, and also the children don't know that they are observed. That's why they can have data which is, or the behavior which is pure and clear, without any kind of alternation when it comes to the behavior demonstrated by children. That's
good,
why
Hamza, good, but still you
Professor?
haven't yet touched upon the what I have in mind. Who?
I think it's Nasruddin.
Yes, please, Nasruddin.
I think in the case of children, there aren't many factors that interfere to shape their perception in comparison to adults.
Good. They are still tabula rasa. Not 100%. They are in those. Yes, please.
And also the lack of, in comparison to adults, the lack of experience and the background and whatnot.
Good. So
lack of experience is part of, like, they still haven't, like, as adults don't have experiences or other factors that might interfere in the study.
Because when we study adults they carry with them a whole history of experiences. It is very difficult. It is very difficult to take one individual, you study them based on certain characteristics, based on certain variables, and then you tell us that whatever we found with that individual is applicable to all individuals the world over. It's impossible to think of that. But with children they haven't yet been socialized into the communities where they live. They are still in those earliest embryonic stages. Their cognitive structures are not yet mature enough to make them a complex subject for study. And therefore, to be able to generalize from that particular situation to the population of children all over the world was possible. That's why Piaget was successful. Now, what supports what I'm talking about here is what is one of the important areas where case study, the kind of case study we're talking, because we need to make a difference between the case study we're talking about now and the case study we're going to talk about in relation to qualitative research. That's a bit different, okay? So remember this. Case study in the context of qualitative research is not exactly the same as case study in the context of quantitative research. Okay?
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right. So to support my argument, another reason why we use case study in the context of quantitative research. Before I continue along this line, what is the context? It is said in the chapter that we use case study, the kind of case study we're talking about now. We use it in clinical psychology. And what is special about clinical psychology? What is special about it, in your view?
Special cases, sir.
That's what I'm talking about. It deals with special cases, personality disorders, schizophrenic people. How many schizophrenic people do we have in the whole world? How many, I don't know, individuals in the world have a particular type of phobia? These are very rare, exceptional, and unusual cases. And therefore, when you take just one, and you study them, and you study him or her, whatever conclusions you're going to find, you can say that they apply to other similar cases all over the world. So do you understand now why we can when we do case study research within the context we're talking about right now, we have some reason to generalize. But again, if you read the chapter well, towards the end, especially in this section where the author started talking about the strengths and weaknesses of case study research, he pointed out that
to the external and internal validity, that case studies tend to be weak in external validity. Yes.
Great, Yuna. Both external and internal validity. Do you still remember the difference between these two? What is external validity? It's concerned with what?
The extent of generalizability.
Results.
And internal validity. It has to do with what?
With the methods.
With
the methods used in the
research variable.
I didn't get it, Hamza. I didn't get your answer. Simply internal validity, it has to do with the explanation that you provide to explain whatever is going on between between the variables you are studying. Okay, there is always remember, this is something we talked about again. There is always the potential for a third, fourth, fifth explanation of whatever phenomenon we're talking about. Okay, so when you study just one individual and you say, I don't know, this is why. Again, when we do case study research, that is we are not in a good position to explain. when you do descriptive research in general, you are just describing things as they are. You start to describe only when you do correlational research. That is, you are in a good position to do it, and you are in a perfect position to give explanations when you are doing experimental research. I think we need to be clear about that and never go back to it. Okay? So we're going to close the topic of case study research.
Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
One question about case study.
Yes.
In the contemporary scientific community, to what extent...
what scientific community you're talking about? We have so many different scientific communities.
And the one that is related to linguistics.
Okay, yes.
To what extent a case study that is based on a theory that is based on a case study is valued?
We're talking. We had the example of Piaget's developmental cognitive theory. It is based on a case study, and it has some validity. Why it has some validity? It's simply because of all of the things that I've been talking about so far. Because children were unique cases. And again, when you deal with, for example, in clinical psychology, when you deal with a rare case, with a rare personality disorder, I think you are in a good position to generalize, because all over the world there are very few people who have that particular characteristic that you investigated. So you can do some generalization, but when you deal with normal people in normal circumstances, and you take one individual and you claim that you're gonna whatever you're talking about with regard to that particular individual, you can apply it to other contexts, then you are standing on slippery grounds, and you stand good chances of being vociferously criticized by the research community, because the case study that you are conducting runs the risk of not having internal and external validity. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, Professor.
Professor?
Yes, please. Yes.
So the fact, can we say that research case study is more useful in clinical psychology than in
100%, 100%, because as I said, you don't have lots of cases. How many cases would you have to deal with certain personality disorders or phobias and so on and so on? You have very few examples, very few instances, and therefore sometimes it is the best option that you have available. All right. Okay. Now, let's now turn to the main dish, as you can see, and that is descriptive. Of course, we've been talking about descriptive research in our discussion of case study research, but now we're going to go to those earliest points raised in the chapter. So first thing we need to provide is a definition of descriptive research. Can you give me an all-including, an all-covering definition of descriptive research? What is descriptive research to you?
Is simply measuring variable as they exist naturally.
And what does that mean in relation to the other types of research designs that we have covered so far?
Here, in contrast, here,
this type of research is not interested in the relationship between the variables. What causes what? We are simply concerned with describing the variables that we are working with.
Okay, good, great. Remember, there was one occasion when I, especially when we were talking, I don't know whether it was correlational or experimental. You were trying to provide me with definitions of either experimental or correlational research, and you were using this word to describe, descriptive, and I warned you against using that. It is exactly because of what we're talking about now, because descriptive research is a special type of research. It doesn't go beyond describing phenomena as they occur in their natural settings. So this is a basic definition for descriptive research. It does not try to provide explanations of why there were certain relationships between variables, or why we have a particular outcome within the context that is being studied. It simply describes things as they are. So this is what is unique about descriptive research. Another important thing I would like to add, still talking about defining descriptive research, is when you do experimental research, especially when you want to write your research report, it is always highly recommended that you devote a section where you need to describe your variables to us before you get engaged in inferential statistics, in trying to see whether there is a correlation between two variables, or in trying to see whether there is some effect of a certain independent variable on another dependent variable, and so on. So the first thing you need to do in your research report is to describe. You provide us with graphs, scatter plots, tables with mean, standard deviations, maximums and minimums, and other stuff, other descriptive statistics. When you do correlational research, it's the same situation. That is, you need to devote a special section where you need to provide us with the descriptive statistics that summarize your treatment of the data that you've collected. So whenever we do research, be it experimental or correlational, we need to include descriptive statistics. But when you do descriptive research, you are not allowed to examine any correlations between variables, and you are not trying to ascertain whether there is some effect of a certain variable on another variable. Is that clear for everyone?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So that's as far as defining descriptive research is concerned. The chapter also raises a number of issues, like the difference between behavioral observation and observational research design. What is your take? What is the difference between these two, behavioral observation and observational research design?
Professor?
Yes?
In the chapter, behavioral observation is referred to as a measurement technique that can be used in various research designs, but when it is applied with the purposes of describing variables solely, it falls under the umbrella of behavioral observational research design.
Great. So we understand that behavioral observation can be either a technique, a strategy that we may want to use to measure a particular variable, or it could be a research design. So if it is used within other research designs like correlational or experimental, it's simply a technique. But when we use solely, uniquely observational, behavioral observation, then we are engaged in a kind of research that we may want to describe as observational research design. Okay, now, behavioral observation has two problems. One is, the chapter refers to the first as reactivity, and the second is subjective judgment. What do you have to say about this?
Professor?
Yes?
Reactivity occurs when the participants feel that they are being observed by the researcher, and as a result, they adjust and they change and modify their behaviors as a way to meet the researcher's expectations.
Yes?
Reactivity refers to the fact that the observer is an active influence in the environment that he or she wishes to investigate naturally, therefore contradicting the whole purpose of the research. And the subjective judgment refers to the subjective nature of interpretation that the researcher will have to make at the end of at the end of the description of the environment.
Yes, good answer, great answer. Yes, please. The others, what can you say about reactivity?
Sir?
Yeah.
When we speak about reactivity, reactivity apparently can it deals with the measurement procedures where the act of measuring change the behavior being measured. That is to say, when the observers who are being observed, people who are observed, they as soon as they discover that they are observed, they change the behavior, how they act, and as a result, this of course could lead to a kind of contamination of the behaviors of their behaviors. So that's another.
Okay, good, great. So whenever this issue of reactivity is raised, I cannot help thinking of an example that always occurs to me. It's a good example that can be used for illustration of what we mean by this phenomenon of reactivity. And I'm pretty sure that you have experienced this as students. Remember when you, I don't know, it could be any teacher of any subject. It could be, I don't know, Islamic studies. It could be mathematics. It could be physics or whatever. Whenever you are being visited by the inspector, or now there is a change in the title. Now it's called supervisor. Your reaction to the teaching of the instructor differs. It's not exactly the same as the way you respond to your teacher's cues, prompts, and questions if there was, or if there were no inspector, if there were no supervisor. The observation that we can make, given this context I'm talking about, is whenever there is a supervisor in the classroom, there is this tendency on the part of students to participate actively. Even those students who've never said a single word, you notice that they are so excited about providing an answer. Everybody is lively, everybody is willing to participate, and so on. But in regular, normal circumstances, when there is no supervisor, you notice that just a few of your students, it could be 4, 5, 6 students, who are active participants in your lessons. The others simply slip into the background and they disappear, and maybe some of them never utter a word. And I'm pretty sure that you've already noticed this observation.
Yes, definitely.
So this is exactly what we're talking about when we refer to reactivity. The way people react when they know that they are being observed is not exactly the same way they react when they are in a natural setting, when they know that nobody is looking at them, nobody is observing their behavior. So this is exactly.
Yes, sir. I have another example within the frame of sociolinguistics, for instance. If participants are aware that they are observed, they will change the way how they speak. For example, we can have this notion of hypercorrection. They start using certain variables. But when you are involved unconsciously and in a incognito way to be involved within this your participants, they will automatically speak at ease. They will not be aware that that they are observed. So this is a good example within.
Again, when you mentioned this example, I remembered another one. This idea of, especially in sociolinguistics, that is this relationship between language and society. Sometimes when you are in a family context, when you're talking to your parents, mother, father, brother, sister, etc., etc., the kind of language that you use is usually you use the vernacular. You don't use standard Arabic. You don't engage in using some foreign borrowings like French words or English words and so on. But if you are in a context with friends or maybe with somebody who is foreign to you, a stranger, for example, then you would start to use French vocabulary. You would from time to time utter some standard Arabic vocabulary and so on. Why are you doing all of that? Because you know that you are being observed. More than that, you know that you are being judged. You know that having finished that conversation, having got away from that particular context, the people gathering are going to judge you. They're going to classify you according to your qualities, according to your language abilities. So again, this is another good example of what we mean by reactivity. Now, the chapter mentions an important strategy as a researcher that you can employ to avoid this problem of reactivity. What is it?
Habituation.
Habituation.
Great. And what does that mean? What does that? Yeah.
Habituation is that researcher should go to the research context. For example, if he is going to observe a classroom, he should or she should go to the classroom several times so that he can make his or her presence familiar to the students.
Yes, good.
Sir?
Yes.
Professor, is when you involve yourself without being consciously, it is called also the overt observation. That is to say, you can be a part within your participant without really any kind of interference or without their awareness. But this is a serious problem, because this could engender the problem of ethical circumstances, because we normally have to ask the permission from my participants that I can observe them. Otherwise, I can somehow ethical issues in that sense. So,
okay, good. Okay, good.
Oh my God!
Yes,
overt observation.
Yes,
about
yes.
Observation, sir. We have this problem of it. Yes.
To answer Hamza's question, it said in the paper that the researcher can observe the participants as long as they are in a public space, even though without their knowledge that they are being observed. So how is that contradicts the ethics of the research?
Go ahead.
Are you answering or asking a question?
No, I'm asking.
Okay, can you please repeat your question?
Sir, can I answer?
Because you said you wanted to answer Hamza's question, but now you are asking. Can you please repeat your question?
No, I'm saying that in the article it said that you can observe the participants as long as they are in a public space.
Because you are not, to answer your question very briefly, because then you are not intruding on their privacy, because they are already in a public place. So there is no problem if you can make your observations. The problem is
spying.
Professor.
Yes, please.
I have read in another parts or another chapters, not in that specific book. We have one notion called the minimal risk, in the sense that we go at minimal risk, and this minimal risk refers to the fact that we can somehow, to a certain extent, violate this ethical issues, as long as we can't harm or injure others' privacy, as you mentioned previously. But this notion is still unclear for me. It's not clear at all. To what extent, what are the criteria which help me or makes the picture more clear, clearer, in the sense that this can violate the ethical issues, the other one cannot violate the ethical issues, because I feel like they touched upon the issue, then they come back. Like, it's not really clear.
Okay, so let me just answer question by question, because you are bombarding me with lots of questions in one shot. Remember, the chapter talks about a number of cases. He talks about infiltrating a gang in order to examine gangsters' behavior. Are you going to tell the gangsters that you are a researcher doing research on gangster behavior? Because if you do, you will get a shot in the head.
And if you don't, you'll get sued.
Sure. And therefore, and therefore, there is something here called a degree of deception. I talked to you about this some time ago. A degree of deception. We also noticed this when we talked about the example of phobia of spiders or snakes, I guess, in the same chapter. Didn't you notice that there was some deception on the part of the researcher when he told the clients, the patients, that their heart rate is decreasing, which reflects that they got rid of the problem of the phobia from snakes? But now what can we understand from this? Because you are raising ethical issues. What can we understand from this? Sometimes certain researchers, they give more weight, they give more importance, they give more significance to the common good than to what is socially acceptable. Because they believe that if they can get a cure based on the research that they are doing, despite they are using some deception, eventually they're going to help a lot of people who are suffering from that particular, be it biological disease or psychological disorder. So sometimes we give more weight, more importance to the common good, and we compromise the ethics of research. So we have to understand this. Okay?
Yes,
sir.
But
yes,
sir,
yes.
The reactivity or the observer paradox that I mentioned in at the beginning of this session, and I still have problems with this concept of habituation. I mean, I question to what extent does this process actually work? It is very, I think it's very oversimplified here by saying habituation, repeated exposure until the observer's presence is no longer a novel stimulus. But I don't. Yes.
Just give me the chance to answer, because as you know me, that is, if you don't give me the chance now, it's gonna go away.
It's okay.
Okay, so we have to understand that maybe we are talking about this and we see that it's difficult from the context of educational research. For example, how could it be that as a researcher you would start to appear like a normal presence in a classroom, in a class of students? How would they start to perceive you as a normal presence? It's very difficult.
And how do you, sir? And how would you know? It's not testable. How would you know that they have started acting naturally after you have spent 3 or 4 or I don't know, 2 years? And how do you know how much time they need to start acting naturally?
Okay, Yunus, I'm just preparing the ground for an answer when I talked about this context of the educational research. Again, we have to understand that educational research, that is, I wouldn't say it's an infant type of research, but in comparison to other types of research like anthropology and ethnography, it is an infant in its infant stages. Now, this idea of the researcher as having different levels of participation within the community he or she is studying, it dates back to research done in anthropology and ethnography. Especially in anthropology. In anthropology, certain individuals, that is researchers, used to go and live with certain people, with certain cultures, with certain tribes for longer periods of time until they are subsumed under the fabric of that community, and until they are no longer perceived as a stranger. They become, they melt into that community, and therefore, at this point in time, he or she can start to make observations without the fear of the participants reacting in ways that do not reflect exactly how they perceive things around them. So in certain contexts, it is possible, especially in anthropology and ethnography. But in educational research, it depends on the context. That is, there isn't a one-fits-all formula I can give you to solve this problem. But it depends on what you are doing. You weigh the pros and the cons of the situation, and if you feel that it is possible, do it. If you feel that it is impossible, you have other alternatives. Okay, turn to other alternatives, because we don't have only one possibility. There are always different ways you can go about doing your research. Okay, does that make sense to everyone?
Yes, but how about, I have another question. How about if the researcher, him or herself, has some, I would say, natural constraints? For example,
what do you mean?
For example, yeah. So how? Let's imagine a female researcher who wants to investigate a phenomena in a male group or a male fraternity or a male cultural community, and it's an ethnographic study, and she's going to go to that community and start observing and taking and noting and everything, but it is very questionable to what extent will the men there open up about their culture, their community, and whatnot to the female researcher. And this can go vice versa. I mean, if we think of a male researcher who is investigating a phenomena in a female community, so is there a chance that, or there's a possibility that we can have something? Look, that
Yunus, it depends. The situation is too complex. It's too complex. Taking the example that you've raised, this idea of whether a female researcher would be able to get valuable information if it is studying some sensitive issues pertaining to the male community. Again, it depends on the cultural context where this female is doing her research. In outside, for example, of Morocco, in a Western culture, maybe males would be more open to a female than it is to a male. But for example, here in the context of Morocco, that is Arab countries and so on, it's vice versa. It's the other way around. Again, it depends on the context where you are doing your research. You have to be, because you are the expert. You have to chart the terrain. You have to know what you are dealing with first before you step and you start doing your research, because it wouldn't be a good idea until you get to the middle of it and then you discover that you have made bad decisions, because then you would have spent something like a good portion of time, and that's a good portion of time would just go in vain. So before you do anything, you need to make your planning, and you need to study whatever beforehand. You need to study, you need to plan, you need to make sure that what you are going to do is going to lead you where you want to go. If not, you need to make amendments. You need to make alterations. Okay?
Yes.
All right. All right. No, so you see, this is just one little point, but it has eaten up a good portion of this meeting's time. So we go immediately to subjective judgment. And what does that mean to you, please? What does it mean?
Sir?
Yeah.
That is to say, it means that subjective judgment, that the researcher could be very subjective in his interpretation, and he could interfere in that sense and give his own way on his own interpretation in a specific behavior. For instance, if we can see two children are fighting, I can't say, for example, that one who caused the other one, but I can say automatically that maybe that behavior is caused because that child, for example, is reckless or something like this. So I can give my own subjectivity regarding the interpretation of a certain behavior. This is the subjective judgment.
Okay, good. Anybody else with a different answer, please? Same question, the question of subjective judgment as being one of the problems inherent in behavioral observation. What can you say about that?
Well, it is a potential pitfall in observational research. It can be minimized in the sense that we can establish behavioral categories prior to the research, and we can assign two or more researchers to observe and record simultaneously, in order to have a more consistent and more value-free evaluation of the data.
Yeah, okay. And that's what's called inter-rater reliability, I guess.
Okay, good. When we talk about subjective judgment of what? Because that would be a good step in the right direction answering this question.
Of data analysis.
It's not data analysis.
Of the behavior.
And observation.
Of behavior. Because, for example, talking about the example, the chapter talks about aggressive behavior in children. What counts as aggressive behavior to one researcher may not count as aggressive behavior to another researcher. And here we have a problem of bias. One researcher is going to tell you that what happened just right now is aggressive behavior. The other is going to say, no, maybe the child was playful, was just playing. That reflects his playful mindset. So this is the idea. Now, it's not useful only to know what subjective judgment is, but you need to know how to troubleshoot it, how to fix this issue. If, for example, you are doing behavioral observation, what is this technique the chapter talks about to solve this problem of subjective judgment?
First of all, we have, I think, Professor, first of all, we have to define the terms. Like if we're talking about like the example that you have just mentioned about being aggressive. So we have to define what is aggression first, so that we can agree on so that we can be on the same ground, so that when I interpret this notion of aggression, it will be interpreted by all the observers. And in the article, there is what we call behavior categories, classifying behaviors into what we call behavior categories.
Good.
And so that we can just like have the same so that we can be on the same ground. And when we interpret, we are going not to fall in what we call inter-rater reliability.
Again, that is another technique. Yes, yes. Good Nordin, somebody else? Yes. Hamza?
Sir, yes, I have an example. For instance, if I want to deal with the physical aggression, first of all, I have to operationalize what we mean by physical aggression. I could be like kicking, biting, for example, hitting another person. Then when any of this behavior occur, then I have to put it in one of the boxes which I have already operationalized, so that anything could happen. I could already should already happen in the boxes or the matrix which when I operational.
I lost you, Hamza. I lost you.
We did too.
Professor?
Are you still there, Hamza?
Professor?
Okay. Yes, Tisam, go ahead.
Another solution for subjective judgment would be the list, as Nordin has said, and the researcher may use well-trained observers as well to help him. And finally, the use of 2 or more observers ensure the reliability of the observation process.
Good. Now, all of your answers are good. Okay, you touched upon the answer that I expected. Again, let me give you the example of something that we are all familiar with: the classroom and the inspection made by the supervisor. As you may have noticed, when the supervisor comes in, he is always having in hand a checklist that lists a number of criteria, a number of categories, and that is something that Nordin talked about and also Tisam referred to. Without this checklist, it is very difficult to rate, to categorize and to rate the behavior of the teacher inside the classroom, and therefore to make this technique of observation convenient. To make it more effective, you need to have a checklist, and then you start rating those different categories that together define teacher performance, because that is what you are interested in: teacher behavior, teacher performance inside of the classroom. Now, if you use the checklist alone, again, there is a problem. What is this problem? If you have already seen the checklist, it is usually a list of criteria, and next to each criterion, you have a rating scale from 1, for example, to 5. For example, I don't know, voice projection. Okay, if we take this as one of the criteria in the list. Of course, teachers would differ in terms of voice projection. Some would have very strong voice projection, others medium, others low voice projection. And therefore, you need to rate this from 1 to 5. You can rate it 5, you can rate it 4, 2, etc., etc. Now, the problem is what one researcher, what one observer would rate as, let's say, 3 on a scale of 5 as far as voice projection is concerned, another researcher might give it, I don't know, 2, or might give it 4, or might give it 5. And therefore, the second important technique you may want to use to troubleshoot this problem of subjective judgment is to have more than one observer. It could be 2, it could be 3. And when you collect the data, gleaned from those checklists, you are going to try to calculate an estimate of the proportion of agreement between all of those ratings. This is called inter-rater reliability. That is, if you run sometimes we can even use what is called the Pearson product moment coefficient. That's something we talked about. If there is a strong correlation between the rating of one observer and the other observers, we can be happy. Why? Because our raters are perceiving the same thing. They have the same judgment on the same set of criteria. But if we discover that there isn't any statistically significant correlation between all of the ratings provided by the observers, then that's a wake-up call for us to try to provide them with training, help them out to come to an agreement, to come to a consensus as to what they're supposed to be observing in the classroom. So in addition to using a checklist, it is much preferable to use what is called, this last thing I referred to, I just, it slipped my mind. What is the last thing I talked about?
Interrelated choices.
No, using more than one rater, more than one observer. So does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Concerning inter-rater reliability, we don't have, again, only one estimate, one statistical procedure to calculate that. We have so many. One of them is, as I said, Pearson product moment coefficient. Another is Cronbach's alpha. I'm not sure whether you already heard about this or not. Are you familiar with Cronbach's alpha?
No.
Reading it, yes. Knowing about it, not really.
Okay. So we might have the chance sometime later to talk about this in detail. So Cronbach's alpha is, again, another measure we used to check out inter-rater reliability. Again, we have so many estimates. Each one of them has strengths and weaknesses. And usually, to use 2 or 3 at the same time, you have that is more likely that you're going to have good results. That is, when you use only one of them, that is Cronbach's alpha or Pearson's product moment coefficient, it's not really that's enough. But when you use a number of them, it is always good. As you can see, Hamza has uploaded the something connected with Cronbach's alpha, and that is what I'm talking about. Okay. Thank you, Hamza.
You're welcome, sir.
Okay, now, what time is it now? 1 hour and a half. Shall we continue? Or leave that until next time? By the way, I have actually I have to leave now because I need to get my lunch. That's one thing. Another thing, at 5 there is a public speaking contest which is gonna take place online. It is prepared by Professor Yiru and Professor Al-Aboudi. And the students who are gonna benefit from this are maybe S2, S3, and S5 students. And I was invited to participate in this. So I need to have something like half an hour to get a rest, have my lunch, and join this context. For this reason, we're going to put off, not put off, we're going to stop at this point. And if there is anything that we haven't yet talked about, we're going to cover it next time. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes.
Okay, so before we call it a day, any questions?
No question. So far, so good, I think.
Okay, great. I'm really happy. When I hear that so far so good, it's great. It's great. Okay, it was a pleasure talking to you again. And until I see you next time, have a good one. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Have a good one too. Stay safe. Bye, sir.